When people talk about property rights, they probably think of things like land or houses or factories. You think about stuff. But private property is about more than just stuff. The reason it's important, really, is that it's about us. It's about the individual and how we relate to the world through our stuff. When I think of private property, I think about spoons. Let me show you.
See, this is a Soviet Army issue spoon. It belonged to a member of the Soviet military. It's big, but it's not particularly heavy. It's made out of aluminum. It's pretty ordinary standard issue stuff. But it's actually very special because, see, spoons in the Soviet Army were private property. See, the Soviet Union was a communist society that officially abolished private property. And if you were in the Soviet Army, you didn't own anything. You didn't even own your own uniform. But by tradition, spoons were considered property of the individual soldier. And as a result, the soldiers often decorated their spoons with really elaborate designs. You can see the soldier has carved a Roman numeral onto the spoon. I don't know if that's his unit number or a birth date or what, but that's less interesting to me than these markings here at the end of the handle. You see, this soldier has tried to draw a kind of sunrise design like you sometimes see on fancy cutlery. There's no utility to these markings. They're just intended to make the spoon look nice. And why did he do that? Because it was his spoon. The Greek philosopher Aristotle said 2,000 years ago, "That which is owned by nobody has the least amount of care bestowed upon it."
When something is unowned, nobody takes the time to maintain that thing. They may try to use it, but why bother repairing it? Economists nowadays call that the tragedy of the commons, which is a phrase that refers to the old days in England when large areas of grass were set aside for people to graze their sheep on. Since the grass wasn't owned by anyone, you might as well graze as much as you want without going back and maintaining the grass. The same thing is true whenever property is owned by nobody or by everybody. But when something belongs to me, I'm going to maintain it and take responsibility for it, because I'm the one who suffers the most if it falls apart. Or I might just want to keep it protected. Incidentally, Soviet authorities did not like the idea that spoons were treated like private property. In the 1930s, when the novelist Vasily Grossman wrote a novel about the Battle of Stalingrad, he included a passage in which a Soviet soldier is eating, and when he's done, he cleans his spoon lovingly before putting it away. Soviet officials ordered him to remove the word lovingly because they didn't like anyone mentioning the idea of private property. In one sense, most animals have some kind of an idea of private property. Dogs, cats, birds have an idea of mine and not mine. And children have an innate sense of possessiveness. In fact, Dr. Benjamin Spock, the famous childcare expert, said that parents should not try too hard to teach their children to share, because there's nothing inherently wrong with kids having possessions. It's healthy, an important part of their development. Property rights serve really important psychological values. They help us to define ourselves, to say who we are. That's why people wear t-shirts that express things they believe in, or why they wear jewelry that expresses something important about their personalities.
This is my grandmother's ring. She wore it because she liked Southwestern-style jewelry, and I keep it in memory of her. That's one of the things property does for us.
But it's not just little tokens like rings that do that. People express themselves through their houses, or use their land to express their individuality in other ways. Actually, it's not just land or houses that make up private property. We own our bodies and our brains too. That means I possess my own self, and nobody else has a right to take that self away from me. The famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery in 1818, used to make this point in an especially effective way. He had run away to freedom when he was 20 years old, and he would sometimes begin his speeches by saying, "I stand here tonight as a thief. I stole my head and my limbs from my master and ran away with them." Since each of us owns ourselves, we also own things like our ideas, our opinions, or our education, or our our knowledge. And that's not just a metaphor. It means we have the right to decide whether to trade these things with other people by working for them. And it also is how property works to protect other kinds of rights. The philosopher Ayn Rand said, "Without property rights, no other rights are possible." The reason is that you can't really exercise any of your other rights if you can't own things. You can't have freedom of the press if you're not allowed to own a press. You can't have freedom of religion if the government owns all the churches. You can't have privacy rights if nobody can own a home. Of course, people use property to create things that they need or to trade things. That's what we mean when we say that people use property to create wealth. Without property, the things I produce don't belong to me, which means I can't exchange those things with other people. And that means I have no incentive to produce things. If I spend time and energy making stuff and people just take it from me, well, then I'm just a sucker. I know what you're thinking. What about societies that have succeeded without property rights, like Native Americans? Well, actually, Native Americans did have a concept of private property. The idea that they didn't is a myth that was created by Europeans, partly out of wishful thinking, partly out of cultural misunderstanding, and partly because, well, it served as a handy excuse to take away their land. In fact, anthropologists have never found a human society that lacked the idea of private property. And when people have tried to abolish private property, they have always failed. It's either led to horrible tyranny and murder, like in the Soviet Union, or people have found ways to sneak around and have private property anyway. In the 19th century, the Shaker religious movement tried to abolish private property. But archaeologists have now found evidence of thriving black markets at Shaker communities, which shows that people just can't stop having and possessing and cherishing things. Why do people often want to abolish private property? Well, that goes back to intellectuals like Plato, who thought that the evils of our society are caused by selfish individualism. People treat each other badly because they're greedy, he said. So if we get rid of individualism, our society will be peaceful and orderly. So Plato said we had to get rid of not only the ownership of objects, but also things like the family, because people are possessive about their spouses and children too. Such experiments have always failed. And part of the reason is that property rights actually help us to get along. There's an old saying, good fences make good neighbors. And it's true. People are friendlier to each other if they set boundaries. In places like the Soviet Union, where people were forced to share, even their own houses, the result was resentment, bickering, and distrust, not happy cooperation. In fact, Aristotle predicted that thousands of years ago. When he heard Plato's idea about abolishing property, he made fun of it in his book, The Politics. Some people, he said, imagine that if we eliminated private property, everybody would suddenly become everybody else's friend. Well, it turns out that does not happen. In fact, that's just another example of the tragedy of the commons, when people are forced to share things instead of being allowed to own things. They can't make the decisions that matter, and they start to accuse each other of taking more than their share. This is one reason private property helps promote what economists call efficiency. Efficiency just means without waste. When people own things, they usually want to conserve those things, so they waste less. And if they own things, they have to take responsibility for those things. That's why private property rights are actually good for the environment. Because when things are privately owned, people will take responsibility for them. On the other hand, when things are owned by the public or by the state, they won't. That's why the dirtiest places on the planet are the places where people aren't allowed to own land, like the former Soviet Union or China. One big reason people argue for the elimination or limitation of private property is because they see that some people have a lot and others don't, and they want to equalize things as a way of helping the poor. But it turns out that doesn't happen. When the government starts rearranging people's property rights, wealthy and powerful people typically figure out how to use the government for their own purposes. After all, they usually got rich because they're clever and they know how to work the system. So if you have a bigger system, they just learn how to get even more powerful. That's why places that have tried to abolish private property have ended up still having a few people who enjoy a lot and most people having hardly anything. But in the end, the basic reason we have private property isn't really these big questions about efficiency or the tragedy of the commons. It's because private property is about the individual. A professor named Russell Belk used the phrase extended self to describe how we use things in the physical world to expand and preserve our own personalities. Property helps us plan for the future. It helps us leave something to future generations. It helps us to express and understand who we are. Private property is as fundamental to the human personality as language or music or storytelling. That's why it's so important that it be respected.
The soldier who decorated this spoon wasn't trying to say something profound about the human condition. He was just decorating his spoon. But in doing so, he expressed himself with something that mattered to him because it belonged to him.